Alright, so welcome back. This is going to be our final screencast for Chapter 16, and in this final screencast we are going to take a look at the class Cephalopoda. And the class Cephalopoda includes the squids, the octopus, the nautiluses, the devilfish, and it does include the cuttlefish as well. Now, most of the animals in this particular class are going to be considered predators, and so we do not have any herbivorous or plant-eating cephalopods. And when you look at these animals, you're going to notice that the foot itself is actually basically the head region of this animal. Now, that foot is going to be modified for expelling water. So you're going to find these animals actually having a very large sort of funnel-like structure that's going to be somewhat in this area of the animal. And the rest of the foot area for this mollusk is going to be modified into the various arm structures that you see kind of protruding from the anterior region of the animal itself. Now they can range anywhere from about 2 centimeters all the way up to the giant squid, and that giant squid can get up to 60 feet in length, and it can weigh as much as 1 ton. Now most of the giant squids, the information that we've learned about these animals has actually been learned from animals that have either washed up on a beach, in other words they were deceased, or any of these animals that have been maybe captured in nets by fishermen, etc. And so not a lot is known about the giant squid, but they are one of the largest invertebrates, or animals without a backbone, that is found on this planet. Now the first member of the cephalopods is one called a nautilus. Now this is a particular mollusk where the shell is still present, and you can see the nautilus right up here towards the top of your screen. Now we do have some of the characteristics of the cephalopods. We have the tentacles, or the arms, that protrude from one end of the animal, and you're going to notice this animal actually has a pretty substantial eye as well, but they do sort of look like the gastropods that we just finished discussing back in the previous screencast. Now, if you notice, the shell itself does coil, and as I said, this is kind of similar to the gastropods, but they do not belong to the class Gastropoda. Now, within this shell, you're going to notice that there is a series of gas chambers, and the primary responsibility of those gas chambers is to maintain what we call a neutral buoyancy. In other words, it gives the animal the ability to float in the water and sort of maintain its position within that environment. Now when you look at the cephalopods, of course, the first thing that kind of sticks out, as we had said in the previous screen, is the shell of the animal. Now when you compare the nautilus with the cuttlefish, with the squid, and of course with the octopus, you're going to notice that shell in varying degrees of that animal. In other words, if you look at the nautilus, you're going to notice the shell is pretty prevalent. In other words, it's pretty obvious this animal has a shell. And as we had said, there's going to be various gas chambers that are going to be found in this shell. Now it does coil, but remember, it's not a gastropod. And you're going to notice that primarily the older parts of the shell are going to just simply contain these gas chambers. In other words, there's not really going to be a visceral mass that's going to be present towards the posterior region of this shell. Most of the body of the animal is going to be situated right towards the front. So this is basically where the body of the animal is. Now with this particular shell, you're going to notice there's going to be a very narrow chamber, and you can see that chamber right through here. It's called a siphuncle, and it's going to allow gas to be actually placed into these various chambers. And of course, depending on the amount of gas that's going to be found in these chambers is going to determine the buoyancy of the animal, or basically the position that animal is going to take up within the environment. Now when you look at a cuttlefish, and you can see a cuttlefish shell right here, this is a shell that's a little bit more substantial than you would find in a squid, or of course in an octopus, but not quite as substantial as you would find in a nautilus, and most of the time this shell is going to be enclosed or covered up by the mantle of the animal. Now when you look at the squid, like the squid you guys are dissecting in class, this is when we have a shell that has been greatly reduced, and sometimes they call this shell a pin. Now it's still enclosed by the mantle, but there's really not much of that shell left. Now when you look at the octopus, of course, you're going to notice an animal that has completely lost the shell. In other words, there's really no use for the shell in the octopus. So again, depending on the type of cephalopod you're looking at, the shell is definitely going to vary. Now in regards to locomotion in cephalopods, there's going to be some various ways that these animals are going to get from place to place within their environment. Now, most of the cephalopods do have the ability to forcefully expel water through a ventral funnel or siphon found on that animal. Now, this is going to be a ventral structure, so it's going to be towards the bottom of the animal. Now, if you look over here on the right, you can see an example of a squid up here towards the top, and you're going to notice that what this animal is going to do is it's going to take water into the mantle cavity of the animal, and of course, when that water is forcefully, using muscles, basically released from the animal, it's going to cause that animal to go backwards. And of course, that's a way that this animal could use to actually get away from predators really quickly. And most of the cephalopods can do this. Even the nautilus that we had looked at can still actually forcefully release water from the funnel that you see right here. Now again, with the squids and the cuttlefishes, you're going to see animals that actually have fins that might be kind of similar to some of the fish that you've seen. They have lateral fins. Now lateral means you're going to have fins off to the side. So again, towards the top, you can see fins located right here on this example of a squid. So again, they're going to have lateral fins. And most of the time these fins are going to act simply as stabilizers. In other words, they're not going to function to help propel that animal too much through the environment. Now they will tend to fold these fins up when they do need to move quickly. But again, most of the time they're going to act as stabilizers for the fish, or excuse me, for the cephalopod. Now when you look at the nautilus, of course, the nautilus is going to swim mainly at night, and the way it's going to swim is it's going to actually, as we had said before, fill up these various gas chambers that you see towards the back of the animal, and depending on the amount of gas that's actually found in these chambers is going to determine how far up or how far down the animal actually is within its environment. Now in addition to this, of course, as we had said, we're also going to be looking at the animal being able to actually remove water from the mantle cavity very quickly. So again, it's going to use that jet propulsion that we talked about a little bit earlier. Now the octopus is going to mainly crawl on the bottom, so these animals are going to be found in actually tidal pools or areas of shallow water, but there are actually some deep sea octopus as well. But they mainly crawl about. They're going to use their tentacles or their arms, but again, since they do have that funnel structure, they can, just like the squid and just like the nautilus, they can also forcefully remove water from that cavity, and again use that jet propulsion to get them throughout their environment rather quickly. So when you look at the respiratory system and the circulatory system of cephalopods, you're going to notice that when you look at the respiratory system, all cephalopods are going to have one pair of gills with the exception of the nautilus. In this case, you're going to have an animal that actually has several pairs of gills. Now, most of these animals, since they do have a pretty high demand in regards to oxygen, most of them are going to have a very muscular pumping system to make sure that they keep water flowing throughout that mantle cavity. In other words, we need to make sure we get plenty of oxygen flowing through this area that you see right down here to make sure that those gills can take up the oxygen that they need and carry that oxygen throughout the circulatory system of the animal. Now, the circulatory system has a network of vessels that are going to move blood throughout the gill filaments, as we had said, so they can pick up that O2. Now, this is a case where we have a group of animals that actually have a closed circulatory system. Now, as we had said before, when we looked at the bivalves and we looked at the gastropods, we were looking at groups that actually had an open circulatory system. But this is going to be a situation where the blood itself within the animal doesn't actually pool. It's actually contained and it stays within those vessels, within those arteries, and within those veins. So this is where this group is a little bit different from the bivalves and the gastropods. Now, these animals do have what we call accessory or branchial hearts. And you're going to see these when you dissect into your squid. And you're going to see these branchial hearts actually at the base. And I'm going to show you right down here towards the bottom of the gills in these animals. So again, these are going to be the gills that you see right here. And at the base of each of these gills is going to be a branchial heart. And if you notice, this is going to help to increase the blood that's actually going through the gill capillaries. So this helps to make it much, much more efficient at taking oxygen from the environment and getting it to the various parts of the animal. So in addition to the branchial heart, you're also going to notice they actually have a systemic heart as well. So in essence, these animals kind of have three hearts. So in lab, you need to make sure that you can locate both the branchial heart and the systemic heart in these animals. So what's really amazing about these animals is that the nervous system and the sensory system in these animals is pretty well advanced. In fact, the cephalopod brain is considered the largest brain of any invertebrate. So again, when you're talking about invertebrates, you're talking about animals that do not have a backbone. So we're talking about the earthworms, we're talking about things like insects. These animals belong to that group, and when you compare the brains of these various inverts, these have the largest brains. Now, the sense organs are also very well developed in cephalopods. In fact, the eyes are so complex, and you can see the eye represented right down here, that they actually resemble our eyes very, very closely. In fact, the vision that you would find in most cephalopods is pretty acute, which means they can see things really well. The eyes are very complex. They are complete with a cornea, they have a lens, and they have a retina. So in other words, they can see very similar images to what we see. Now, the cephalopods also have tactile and chemoreceptor cells in their arms, which means that definitely they have a sense of touch, which helps them to manipulate throughout their environment, and of course they're able to pick up various chemicals throughout their environment as well. Now, of course, this can be very helpful when it comes down to locating food. It can be very helpful when it comes down to maybe locating mates, and also definitely helpful when it comes to defending themselves. So again, the nervous system and the sensory system in cephalopods is very, very well structured, very, very complex, pretty advanced for this group of animals. So of course, with a very advanced nervous system and sensory system, you have a group of animals that have the ability to communicate with each other very efficiently. In fact, they're going to use chemical and visual signals to help them communicate. And that's not only communicating with each other, but also communicating with other organisms within their environment. Now, they have chromatophores. Now, these are special cells that are going to be found within the skin that actually contain pigment. And this pigment can actually be manipulated. And so what's going to happen here is these cells actually have muscle fibers that surround these cells. And so these muscle fibers can actually be used to either contract or relax, and when they do that, it actually causes the cell to either expand or again retract. And when that expansion or retraction occurs, it actually changes the color pattern that you notice on the animal. So in addition to changing the color, you're also going to be able to see some cephalopods that can actually change the texture of their skin as well. So there's lots of different ways they can communicate and kind of defend themselves if you think about it, because of course being able to change your color, being able to change your texture can help you to camouflage yourself. In other words, blend in with your environment. So this communication can occur in lots of different ways. Now, in addition to this communication, these animals also tend to have something called an ink sac, and this is something you want to be very careful of when you actually dissect into your squid, because if you rupture that sac, it's definitely going to produce a very black, kind of sticky substance, and it can make your dissection, well, not turn out quite as well. Now, this is going to be contained within an ink gland, and it's going to secrete this ink when the animal isn't alarmed in any way. And so basically you have sort of a cloudiness, sort of a darkness that's going to occur in front of that animal, and it's going to confuse the predator and allow that animal to escape rather quickly. So this ink sac can be pretty important to several species of cephalopods. So when you look at cephalopod reproduction, you're going to notice that the sexes are separate in this group of mollusks. In males, the spermatozoas are going to be packaged in structures called spermatophores, and these are going to be stored by the animal. Now, the male cephalopod, in most cases, is going to have what we call an intromittent organ. Now, when you use the word intromittent, you're talking about an organ that's going to be used to place something into something else. And this is called a hectocotyledus. And so what's going to happen is this particular mammal is going to take this structure and it's going to remove a spermatophore from the mantle cavity and actually insert or place it into the female so these eggs that the female produces can be fertilized. Now these fertilized eggs are going to leave the oviduct and they're going to be attached to stones and various other structures within the environment. Now the eggs that are produced by these animals are going to actually be relatively large yolky eggs when you compare them to other mollusks that we've looked at. Now these particular animals are going to hatch into juveniles, and there's really no free swimming or larval stage with cephalopods. So when these eggs that you see over here on the right hand side, and I believe that these are squid eggs, when these eggs hatch, they look basically like very small miniature replicas of the parent. Alright, so that's going to finish up our last screencast for Chapter 16. So as before, please make sure that you have completed your study guide before you come to class.